Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Beth Keene, and I'm the CEO of Holocaust Museum LA. Thank you for joining us for our annual Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance film series, the only film festival in Los Angeles dedicated to Holocaust films. Our film series integrates films with panel discussions of renowned historians, filmmakers, and survivors, and is moderated by noted journalist, author, and son of Holocaust survivors, Tom Teicholz. This summer's film series, which focuses on documentaries, is supported by the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany. Founded in 1961, Holocaust Museum LA is the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States and houses the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. Our museum's work is more critical than ever, given the fragile state of today's world with the war in Ukraine, humanitarian and refugee crises, and the alarming rise in hate crimes and rhetoric in this country. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at Cal State San Bernardino found that Los Angeles recorded the most hate crimes of any US city this century in 2021 alone. A few weeks ago, the California Department of Justice's annual report revealed anti-Jewish hate crimes rose 32%. We must take action, and education is our greatest catalyst for change. Holocaust Museum LA's mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons of the Holocaust and its continued social relevance, empowering them to speak out and stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. We strive to build a culture rooted in kindness, empathy, and treating people with respect. Film is a great medium for seeding interest, increasing knowledge, educating, and raising difficult questions about the Holocaust. Holocaust Museum LA launched the annual film series in the summer of 2016 through the support of the Teicholz Holocaust Remembrance Film Fund. The fund was established by Tom Teicholz, who has written extensively about the Holocaust and the Holocaust in film. Tom's parents were both Holocaust survivors. His father was a resistance leader who helped save Jewish lives after the war. His mother had been an actress in Hungary. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the panel discussion on the film Speer Goes to Hollywood. Albert Speer was one of Hitler's closest confidants, his chief architect, and tasked with rebuilding Berlin as the capital of the global empire. As Reichsminister of Munitions, Speer was responsible for 12 million slave laborers. And yet, even now, he has the reputation of being the good Nazi, a myth he carefully constructed himself. We are pleased to welcome our panelists this evening for what I'm sure will be an informative discussion. Harry Davids was born in 1942 in Nazi-occupied Holland. Shortly after his birth, his parents made the difficult decision to give him to members of the Dutch resistance who arranged for him to be hidden. After the war, his uncle, who was living in South Africa, found him and adopted him. Harry has spent his whole life tracing his family history and unraveling the mystery of his parents' experience during the Holocaust. He's been a docent at Holocaust Museum LA for nearly 15 years and is passionate about Holocaust education and fighting Holocaust denial and distortion. Professor Stephen Ross is a professor of history and the Marion and Myron Kasdan director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life at USC. The child of Holocaust survivors and the first person in his family to go to college, Steve received his BA from Columbia University and PhD from Princeton University. Steve's most recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America, was on the Los Angeles Times bestseller list for 23 weeks. Ross is currently working on a follow-up volume, The Secret War Against Hate, American Resistance to White Supremacy After 1945. Kelly Goldberg, the granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors and Holocaust Museum LA board member and docent, was born in Antwerp, Belgium, and moved to Los Angeles to launch her music career, where she currently produces music for up-and-coming artists. After stumbling upon Holocaust Museum LA while walking in Pan Pacific Park, Kelly became drawn to Holocaust history. She is passionate about Holocaust education and finding different ways to educate the public about the dangers of hatred and anti-Semitism, something she experienced growing up in Europe. Her father produced Speer Goes to Hollywood. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Tom Teicholz.
Thank you, Beth. And I want to thank the Holocaust Museum LA for creating a home for this film series. We're now in our 6th year. We are, as Beth said, as far as I know, not only the only film series devoted to films of the Holocaust in LA, but I think certainly in the US. And again, it's been a richly rewarding experience. I hope for all who've watched and as well who all participated. Tonight we're discussing this movie Speer in Hollywood, and this documentary. And for those of you who may be joining this panel before watching the film, it is a documentary that deals with the fact that Albert Speer was one of the few Nazis tried at the Nuremberg trial who was not given the death penalty. He was given a sentence of 20 years in prison because, in part because he expressed a remorse and contrition at the trial for the crimes of the Nazis, and also because he was effective at portraying himself as not as removed from those crimes. While he was in prison, he wrote a memoir called Inside the Third Reich, which became a bestseller. And that bestseller was the movie rights for it were optioned by Paramount Pictures, and a screenwriter, Andrew Birkin, got the assignment to adapt the film. And it turns out that Birkin, spent a good deal of time with Albert Speer and recorded over 40 hours of their time together, which very much forms the basis of this documentary. So now I'd like to get into it and first turn to Kelly and ask you, tell us a little bit how your father, Sylvain Goldberg, got involved with this project and how he came upon the raw material which makes up this documentary.
Sure. So my dad, who's actually not in the film industry, it was actually a coincidence. He wanted to work on a different project, and he was looking for producers to work with, or producers or directors. And coincidentally, my mom, who was at a brunch in Israel, spoke to Vanessa and knew that Vanessa was involved in films, and told her, my ex-husband is looking for help for this project that he wants to work on. Is it okay if I give your number to him? So 3 hours later, he calls Vanessa up and he says, I'm going to be in Tel Aviv from Thursday to Sunday. Can we meet? And they meet on that Sunday. And so it was my dad and Vanessa Lapa, who's the director of the film, and Tomer, who's also the co-producer. And they sit, and my dad, tells them about the different project that he wants to work on. And while explaining this project, he mentions Albert Speer a couple of times. And Tomer and Vanessa look at each other, and my dad's like, what's going on, And they're like, listen, we're working on this project, on this film about Albert Speer, and we're looking to finish it, and we need help for it. And that's how my dad came on board with.
So Vanessa and Tomer already had the material from Andrew Birkin.
Exactly. And so how they came across the tapes was, what happened was that Vanessa Lapa, she had made a film a few years ago called The Decent One, which was a film about Himmler, and it's based on his letters and his diaries. So she was actually in New York for the screening of that film, And after the screening, this guy, Stanley Cohen, who's a retired attorney, comes over to her and mentions, the correspondence between Speer and Himmler. And he says, listen, I have this story I need to tell you about. We have to sit down. We need time to talk about this. And at that time, Vanessa had a lot of previous commitments and she had other things to focus on. So they said, let's be in touch. And for about a year, the guy, Stanley emails them to reach out and to say, hey, let's get together. And it was actually Tomer who went behind Vanessa's back to schedule a meeting with this guy. And they went to meet him. And that's where he talked about the story of how Paramount, which is one of the largest movie studios, wanted to make a film about Speer and buy the rights from his best-selling memoir, Inside the Third Reich. And they were shocked and immediately became interested. And so the guy, urges them to go speak to this other guy, Andrew Birkin, who was hired by Paramount to make the film about Speer. And luckily, Andrew accepted to meet up with them. And now this is at the time where they didn't even know about the tapes. So when Vanessa went to Wales to meet up with Andrew Birkin, she stumbled upon an incredible collection of 40 hours of recordings.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, that explains it. By the way, for the fashionistas watching tonight, Andrew Birkin, the screenwriter who wrote The Name of the Rose and wrote and directed several other movies, is the brother of Jane Birkin, for whom the Hermes Birkin bag is named, and the wife of Serge Gainsbourg. So Andrew Birkin is also the uncle of Charlotte Gainsbourg and Lou Doillon. Just little trivia. Steve, so I suppose if a book is a major bestseller, even if it's Albert Speer's Inside the Third Reich, Hollywood is going to come calling. Or a producer is going to come calling. However, I wanted to ask you to sort of give us the context of Hollywood and Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and sort of tell us how it is that they sort of blithely decided to do this.
Well, the first thing to understand is the fundamental fact that Hollywood is in the money-making business, not the consciousness-raising business. It is a for-profit industry. It is, yes, it is an art form, but is first and foremost a business. And so, for many years during the war years, Hollywood was unable to make any film because of the production code that would in any way mock, attack, or denigrate a foreign leader or country. And that meant that throughout the 30s, until January 1940, Hollywood wasn't able to do anything other than the only film they made during the war years was early war years was Confessions of a Nazi Spy in April 1939, because it was based on a true story. And therefore, the production code still asked the Warner Brothers not to make it, sending Harry and Jack a letter saying, technically this film fits under the code because it's based on a trial of Nazi spies, but given the wonderful things Hitler has been doing in Germany, and given the profitable relationship Hollywood has had with Germany, you really want to make this film. And they told them to piss off. So they made that film. So Hollywood had, and only after 1940 does the code change, and you suddenly have a whole series of anti-Nazi films. So then you have the post-war, you have a lot of World War II movies, you have all the buddy films in particular, leaving us with the Tom Brokaw Greatest Generation, Good War. which is only half true, because many people came back from the war feeling betrayed by their country. That when they had left, Jews and Blacks knew their place, particularly in the South. And now they've come home and Jews and Blacks no longer know their place. So we've had a lot of contention over those years. And the grandchildren of those angry people could be seen on January 6, 2021. That's the long story. In terms of this film, so Inside the Reich comes out in the summer of 1970. It's an immediate bestseller. And in 1971, Paramount Pictures hired Andrew Birkin to see if he could hash out a script. And according to then Paramount president, Frank Yablans, the property was actually brought to them by David Putnam, who is a British producer. And he was able to convince Albert Speer that his book could be filmed. And Yablans said he then hired Andrew Birkin, a young British writer in his 20s, to do the film. And Birkin spent, as we've heard, many hours talking with Speer. And in the documentary, you hear a lot of those tape recordings. And in fact, Yablans was quoted as saying, we want it to be a film about people, not spectacles. And we think it will be especially interesting for the large and very perceptive group of moviegoers who are under 30. After all, our youth has been taught about the rise and fall of Rome and Greece, but very little about the rise and fall of Hitler. I think they will appreciate it. Well, they would have appreciated something, but not that. And in fact, it went as far, Paramount went as far as they, apparently, I haven't seen it, but there's reportedly a video out there of Donald Pleasance doing screen test as Hitler. But they apparently also, Paramount approached Stanley Kubrick, asking him to direct the film. And Kubrick told the studio that unless Speer was presented in a way that didn't whitewash him, he wasn't interested. And so clearly Kubrick, once he saw the script, turned it down because it is a whitewash. As the documentary shows us, Speer snookered in so many different people. He is a truly evil man because he poses as a truly respectable, responsible, and contrite man. I don't believe a word of that. And if any of you people out there do, see me about some property in Florida. It's a little underwater, but one day it'll be clear. Anyway, what happened, Paramount eventually dropped it as a production, but they actually turned around in 1973 because they loved the idea, they still love the idea of making a film about the Third Reich. And so when they decided that they were going to do something else, and they made a film called Hitler, The Last 10 Days, that was released by Paramount, starring Alec Guinness as Hitler. The film was vetted for its authenticity by Trevor Roper, very prominent Oxford historian, and that got made. But Inside the Third Reich would have a revival again as a miniseries. So it didn't make it as a feature, but ABC Circle Films produced a 5-hour miniseries in 1982 dealing with the film. And the irony, of course, at least for me, it's an irony, that the director was Marvin Chomsky, who had directed the Holocaust miniseries. And that's where it went. It was 5 hours, and that was the last we saw of Speer and Inside the Third Reich. So that's the backstory.
All right, thank you, Steve. And Harry, you know, as a survivor and as a docent at the Holocaust Museum LA, I wondered how you felt watching this Nazi on screen with all his, as Steve said, niceties and evasions. And also to the extent that you know about what Speer actually did at Sachsenhausen and at the Dora camp. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this man was what you could call the height of deception. He fooled everybody. I'm not sure to what exactly it was that led to the reduction of his sentence. I know that at one point there was some talk that Paul Nitzer's crowd from the government had tried to interrogate him shortly before he was arrested to find out how it was that this man, for example, could develop the armaments industry in such short order and so on before he was sent to trial. And there was a story that in exchange for valuable information, somehow they'd managed to reduce his sentence. I'm not convinced of that, but there's no question that when you look at the way he presents himself, he really was a charmer.
Yes,
And,
I mean, it's really so. The British journalist Gita Sarani, who wrote the book Into That Darkness, also corresponded for many years with Speer and wrote her book, which is will tell you what you need to know. Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth. Now she sort of felt that Hitler, in some ways, hypnotized Speer, and in some ways Speer hypnotized Hitler, and that they had a sort of quasi, almost homoerotic bond, love between them. But I have nothing but the greatest respect for Gita Sarani, who was a great friend to me. But I felt that Speer also hypnotized her a little bit, because he really, and you see him doing it in this film, how he just says, well, does it have to be maybe this? It's quite a performance. Kelly, as someone who did not grow up in an age where we saw Nazis and Nazi war crimes trials and really had this kind of exposure, despite your grandparents, what was your reaction to seeing this sort of erudite Nazi gentleman?
Yeah, to be honest, I had really difficulties, being able to hold in my anger, because you see a man, he's so collected, he's so calm, he's so, confident when he speaks. And, there's a lot of anger on how he was able to just have a 20-year sentence and not the death sentence, where, his subordinates did get the death sentence. So, there's this anger of injustice, where he's able to charm everyone around him. And, as someone who's very sensitive to surroundings around, there's a lot of anger that comes out.
Yeah, and we're going to go to some of the questions from people in a couple of minutes. But Steve, when we're now and in the last 2 years really in this sort of world of post-truth, where people listen to radio and TV and don't accept the truth or are heard things that are not true, and it's continuing at our present and we see, the way the January 6 hearings are treated, as a historian, how do you deal with this man like Speer who presents his own version of the truth? How do we get to history with that?
How do we get to history? How do we get
How do we
to
get
the
to a
truth
history?
of history?
Yes, yes.
I think it requires reading and thinking as opposed to listening to crap. And the other thing it requires is, which is the closest we've actually had, is truth and reconciliation commissions, just like they did in South Africa. We have been avoiding the truth through our whole history. And we have had key moments when we actually could talk about these things and decided not to. After the Civil War, we basically let all the Confederate generals go. Robert E. Lee swore an oath at West Point to defend his nation, and he violated the oath. He should have been hung, along with the other Confederate generals. They were traitors to their country. We should have had a truth and reconciliation in this country after World War II. The closest we had, and I don't know if many of your viewers know this, is the Great Sedition trial of 1944, when several dozen of the most prominent Nazis and fascists in America were brought to trial for sedition. And unfortunately, the judge died towards the end of the trial, and it was declared a mistrial. And the Justice Department waited for over a year, and sometime in 1946 decided, let's just get on, let's forget about this, let's move on. That's the word always, let's move on. Well, you never move on unless you confront the truth. So Albert Speer is able to get away with the kind of murderous lies, and that's all they are. They're murderous lies, because what really, for me, what came out is, and I've known people as ambitious as Albert Speer. They're just not always as successful as Albert Speer. You are not going to be a young architect entrusted with building the Third Reich and not have unbridled ambition and not do whatever you have to do to make sure that happens. And so the only thing I can say is what I say to my students: don't believe anything anyone tells you, including me. Instead, go out and start trying to read things and read multiple sources to try to get, because there is such a thing as the truth. It may not always be easy to get to, but we can get to the truth. And the problem is, most of us, including myself a lot of times, are lazy. We don't want to spend the time really researching what it means to understand something. And, there is a truth. There aren't your truth and my truth. No. Some things, in the same way as you were born on a certain day, that is the truth. It is not your truth or my truth. It is the truth. There is evil in the world, and we can actually see what it is, and we can see who the perpetrators are. Unfortunately, sometimes we get deceived. But again, I do believe that determined people can figure out what the truth is, whether it's Speer's life or what happened on January 6th. As they used to say in the X-Files, the truth is out there.
Thank you, Steve. Harry, anything you want to add to that?
Yes, and this is in the same vein as we heard Professor Ross tell us about now. When it comes to the truth and lies, it's very, very easy to tell lies in a very short space of time, and you can do that on a film. It's much, much more difficult to tell the truth in such a short period of time, especially the whole unvarnished truth. We have the same problem when it comes to Holocaust deniers. It takes very little time for the deniers to espouse their cause by, rattling off their pillars of denial. I could do it probably in 2 minutes myself. To rebut them is a totally different story. You want to see an example of that? Talk about movies. The movie Denial presents that, where here we have a professor, along with a publisher, sued for libel. The plaintiff, David Irving, does not even hire attorneys to represent him. He already has his case down pat. his opponents have to hire a team of highly experienced legal professionals, and it takes them something like 3.5 years worth of what we in America call discovery to ferret out all the things that he had written and all the misrepresentations and distortions in his books in order to make a case. And even then, it took perhaps a month or so before the verdict was read, and no one even knew what the verdict was going to be. Talk about the truth. So here you have an example of how easy it is to rattle out lies and how difficult it is in a short space of time to tell the truth. The liars and the deniers had that huge advantage over the truth.
Yeah, and in this film, interestingly enough, Carol Reed, the director of The Third Man, we hear him speaking to the screenwriter, and he's really the voice of moral reason, because he keeps saying to the screenwriter that, you know, this script, Speer isn't admitting any guilt. How can you write this? How can you write a script where that doesn't happen? And it's fairly shocking. And one of the questions that someone posed was they felt that there was a moment when the screenwriter Birkin was trying to ingratiate himself with Speer, and sort of made a comment about Paramount and the Jewish Brigade that you know was like, whoa. Did you notice that, Kelly, in the film, or are we losing you?
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm just trying to understand the question. I'm sorry.
The question is about when Andrew Birkin says that Paramount and the Jewish Brigade are going to try and whitewash the film. Did that strike you as a moment where you were seeing real anti-Semitic?
Well, I mean, yeah, it shows how easy it is to use a movie, you know, to whitewash and to hide the truth. And I think that's why it's extremely important to preservation of truth. And that's why Speer Goes to Hollywood did just that.
Mm-hmm. By the way, one of the comments is yay to Professor Steve Ross. So I thought I'd pass that along, Steve. You're getting good reviews from our questioners. So this is an unrelated question. Someone's asking about Wernher von Braun and what role he had at the Dora concentration camp. Well, in short, von Braun was the engineer behind the V1 and V2 rockets. Speer was in charge of munitions and slave labor. So to a certain extent, they were both working and both knew what was going on. Obviously, Wernher von Braun, who went on to run the American space program, was able to hide behind both his accomplishments and his sort of talent as an engineer. So, Harry, again, I wanted to ask you, have you had any sort of contact or knowledge of the Dora concentration camp and the what went on there?
Yes, in addition to the fact that we as docents had to study up about these camps, we had an exhibit on the Dora camp at the museum some time back. But we had already, you know, most of us already were familiar with it. There is, in the camp section of the museum, there are a number of videos, touchscreen videos. One of them features the Dora camp, except it's kind of, you know, the complex Dora Mittelbau, Nordhausen, all in the same part of the same complex. And, you know, they talk about these underground tunnels, the terrible conditions under which the people were living. Even the so-called barracks were really underground as well, as was the entire construction area. So most of the docents, I believe, are familiar with that.
I'm looking at the other questions. Some of them are just personal comments. Kelly, you've watched your father sort of live with this process. How was he personally affected by having to spend so much time with Speer and listen to so much of his tapes and be exposed to it?
To be completely honest, my dad is not one to talk a lot, and I only knew about the documentary literally when he was gonna go for the screening in Berlin. He's like, "Oh yeah, by the way, I helped produce this film." So, I do not know the process while he was doing it, but I know he gets very affected by ensuring, again, the truth of the Holocaust, especially because he's a child of Holocaust survivors. And especially Speer was one of the people that really stuck with him for many years.
Yeah. There's a question asking if we know what happened to the huge amount of money Speer made from his book. Yes, we do know. It went to Speer. Speer lived quite nicely and quite well, and to quite a comfortable old age. And if you read Gita Sereni's book, you will see a little bit of Speer's lifestyle, which was quite comfortable. I think that I do think it does. There was Simon Wiesenthal was against the execution of Adolf Eichmann after his trial, because he wanted Eichmann to continue to be a potential witness at future trials. But I think what we see in Speer, and I think would have been true with Eichmann as well, is that these lying mythomaniacs are never going to either accept guilt or tell the truth. And I think history would not be any the richer for their further testimonies. Steve, do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, I would agree. I frankly, Eichmann should have been executed. And you don't keep him around just because maybe he can testify. He's not going to testify. He lied on the stand about himself. Why is he going to tell the truth about anyone else? Speer lied about himself. Why would he expect him? Why would we expect him or any other Nazi who would be caught later on to tell the truth? What, if we finally captured Mengele, he's going to tell us, I was only trying to conduct scientific experiments for humanity's sake? I mean, really?
Yes, I think that's right. So I think that brings us to the end of our conversation. I'm going to give you all the opportunity, if you'd like to have a last word about Speer. But I do think that watching this movie really does only emphasize the importance of the Holocaust Museum in LA and and the Holocaust museums in each of your communities. But let me give you each a chance to have a final word. Harry?
Yes, on that issue of Eichmann versus Speer, there are so many similarities between the two. In both cases, they downplayed their role. in, for responsibility in what had happened in the Holocaust. Well, Eichmann attempted in some ways to make himself a little bit more humble. Speer could never do that. But their basic arguments were the same, that, well, we knew what was going on and we had a part in it, but it didn't rise to the level where you could say we were fully responsible. And in the case of Speer, he's saying, well, yeah, I might have been present and so on, and maybe a person in my position at such a high rank should have known about, and therefore for that reason I'm prepared to take responsibility, but not for the actual implementation.
Kelly,
So
any last words or last thoughts?
yes, I see here Marcy asked about the actual tapes, the original tapes. And I think that's important to say because there's 40 hours of original tape, but unfortunately they weren't able to use it because of continuity reasons. So what happened is they had different locations where they were doing the interviews. Some were in, the home where it was quiet. Then they were doing something else where it was, louder. So that's when Vanessa made, the decision to re-record everything. So then everything sounded cohesive for the film. And also, like, if anyone ever goes to Israel, to Tel Aviv, the studio is always available to go and listen to the recordings.
What studio is that?
I can actually, I don't have the address here, but what is a good way to
What's the name of the studio?
You know what? I don't have the name of the studio.
All right, we won't put you on the spot. Steve?
Let me find it really quickly.
Okay. Steve, last thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think there's a good question here from Shoshana asking regarding Speer. There's an obvious question about whether or not he was someone who knew right from wrong but chose wrong, or was he someone who didn't know right from wrong and went down the path of wrong? There is a very important distinction between these scenarios within the vast body of Torah law. Well, look, I don't know Speer. I can't speak to what is in the man's heart and in his mind, but from everything I've read, he knew the difference. I mean, really, he knew there was mass extermination. He knew what was going on, but his ego and desire for fame and the desire to be the architect of the Third Reich that was going to live forever, I think overwhelmed him, and he just closed his eyes to all the evil and just said, I'm going to do what I'm going to do.
And we see that very clearly when he's confronted with the fact that when he was going to redo Berlin, he was going to destroy the Jewish neighborhood and that all the Jewish residents were going to be moved to concentration camps. He just says, well, we had to do that so I could, create his city for the 1,000-year Reich, the capital of the 1,000-year Reich, which lasted all of 12 years. So yes, I think we know that that Speer was not. It wasn't that he couldn't tell between right and wrong. It's that he was an opportunist of the highest order. And as he says, one day he meets this guy Hitler, and the next day they're standing and Hitler's saying, "You're my architect." And Speer couldn't resist that and resist doing what he felt he would do regardless of who had to die, so that he could do that. Kelly, were you able to find what you were looking for?
I did, yes, and I'm writing it into the chat for everyone with the number if anyone,
Okay, why don't you say it so that people can hear?
So it's Real Work Studios, and it's on Abu Lafia Street, 13 Abu Lafia Street.
Okay, and you can look in the chat if you're interested. And with that, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Kelly and Steve and Harry for being so generous with your time and your knowledge and for participating in this series. I also want to thank our incredibly generous donors, the Consulate General of Germany and Stefan, who found the money for this year's series. Thank you, Stefan. I want to thank the Rita and Leo Greenland Family Foundation, the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Foundation, the Davidson Hooker Foundation, and the Richenthal Foundation. This is the third film of our series. There are two more on the next two Tuesdays. Next Tuesday, we're going to be discussing a very interesting documentary called Pizza in Auschwitz. That is an Israeli film and a intergenerational drama about an Israeli family that accompanies their father on his final visit to the concentration camp where he was interned, and the bickering that ensues. And again, thank you and good night from everyone at the Holocaust Museum LA. Good night. Thank you.